Hi, welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Rebecca Morgan, Director of Collector Services, and we are joined once again today by Nikki Harris, Collector Services Manager, and Chris Barker, Information and Research Manager at the Royal Mint Museum. November is a significant month in the year because it is the time in which we all remember the fallen, those who give their tomorrow for our today. World War I in particular had an interesting effect on the Royal Mint's production of the sovereign, and Chris is going to talk us through that period of time in the Royal Mint's history, followed by Nicky, who is going to talk through some of the coins of that era and his particular favourites. If you have any questions, please use the chat facility and we will get back to you at the end of the webinar.
Good morning everyone, and welcome to the latest in our webinars. We are going to be looking today at the history of branch mints. Yet again, as with all the talks that I give in these, some of the content may be new to you and some of it, hopefully, you might be a bit familiar with. But I hope everyone can take something away from this. Where we're beginning today is in 1850. So I want to take you back to that particular year. Queen Victoria is on the throne. She has been on the throne for well over a decade now. And the British Empire has expanded around the globe. Reaches all the way to Australia, parts of South Africa, or what today is South Africa, on the continent into Canada. It's a huge behemoth. In addition to that, the British coinage is an imperial coinage. It could be taken from the United Kingdom and theoretically spent anywhere around the globe, although in reality there's a little bit of a difference. At the top of that imperial coinage tree is the sovereign. It's a coin by 1850 that is very well established. It's been in active circulation since its introduction in 1817, but it is not the sovereign that we really recognise today. And I say that not because its specifications were different in 1850, because its design was. Today we're very used to seeing St George and the Dragon. But what we forget is that St George and the Dragon initially was only on the sovereign for a very short space of time. Comes in 1817 and then disappears in 1825. What the public in 1850 would have been used to would have been the shield reverse design that you can see on screen here. By modern standards, this coin is extremely high value as well. So if you were to take the sovereign equivalent today, you'd have something that'd be like an £80 coin, something we're not used to really in day-to-day use. Putting you back in the period of 1850, it's equivalent to roughly around about 4 to 5 days worth of salary for a labourer. And by this point in history, it's the coin that was increasingly greasing the wheels of that colonial commerce. And we can see from this rather nice poster that this is a coin that really is being sent. The fact that in 1837 you have to get these notices going up in the post offices to talk about how you should be sending gold is an interesting point generally. Now these coins are being made at the Mint in London. And the Mint in London at this point in history is based at Tower Hill. Tower Hill has been in use since about 1810, 1812. It takes a couple of years to transfer from our old site at the Tower of London. The coins have to travel around the globe if they're going to get to the places that they need to be, particularly with this expansion of empire. And part of the problem with this is that this is an extremely hazardous route. As we can see from the slide on screen, trying to get coinage made in London at Tower Hill all the way to Australia in the 1850s is very, very difficult. You have to go from some very treacherous routes, down past Africa, underneath the Cape of Good Hope, across to Australia. In 1850, you're dealing with sailing ships that will be transporting this, and it will take around about 4 months to get your goods from England all the way to Australia. Very hazardous route as well. You've got some extremely treacherous and rough seas. Now, this isn't so much of a problem at the start of the 1850s, but what starts this whole branch mint expansion off is the discovery a year later in 1851 of gold in Australia. This is part of the start of that whole discovery of gold around the world. You have in America the gold rush, that sort of iconic depiction of people rushing across to Western America after the discovery of gold in 1848. And it's a similar sort of thing for Australia in 1851. Very, very small non-Indigenous population in Australia at this point in time. After gold is discovered, you end up with this huge emigration into Australia as people try to maximise and capitalise on the discovery of gold. In the year following its discovery, you end up with roughly about 325,000 people emigrating to Australia. That is equivalent to a town the size of Cardiff moving all the way across to Australia in 1 year, which gives you some idea of how quickly the population booms and expands. This discovery of gold doesn't just lead to an explosion of population, it also creates its own problems. You have been for many, many years shipping gold and coinage from London all the way to Australia. Very small demand generally, so it's not so much of a problem if it takes a while to get there. As soon as you get a boom in population, as soon as you start to discover gold, what happens is you need more coin, and you get increased demands for gold coin in Australia. The gold diggers themselves also want to maximise their profits. So they are turning out of the ground this raw gold, and what they want to do is turn it into gold coin in the form of sovereign, and that generates a greater profit for them. The problem with this is that they have the same issue. They have to send it all the way from Australia back to London in the 1850s. And as soon as gold is discovered, and as soon as it becomes an established discovery in that there's plenty of it and it's of high quality, you get petitions from the gold diggers to start a branch in Australia. Now, initially, there's some thought that this won't be picked up by the UK government. And so what happens is you end up with a government assay office established in Adelaide in Australia in 1852. And they break royal prerogative because what they do is they actually start producing their own token gold coinage. And that is what you can see on screen here. It's struck for a very, very short period of time. And in that short period of time, you only end up with about 24,000 of these pieces made. Despite that, like I say, they are breaking royal prerogative. They're going beyond the bounds of what they should be doing. They should not be striking a coinage, albeit sort of a token coinage, out of these gold coins. And that is why it's brought to a close quite quickly. Another reason why this is brought to a close is because the Royal Mint and more generally the government of the United Kingdom at the time agree to the development of a branch mint in Australia. And that comes in 1853. One of the real strengths of the Royal Mint Museum's collection is its series of pattern pieces and test pieces and the real oddities and the real rarities. And this is a real beautiful example of that we see on screen here. It's agreed to develop a branch in Australia in 1853, and in that year, the Royal Mint in London starts developing pattern pieces and pattern designs for what the new Australian gold sovereign might look like. And that is what we can see on screen here, a rather beautiful proof piece. One of the interesting things that you might notice about the coin that you've seen on screen is that it's completely different to the sovereign that we saw earlier with the shield back. So when the Australia branch opens in Sydney in 1855 and finally starts making these gold coins, they are not the same in design as those struck in the United Kingdom. And instead, what you have on the reverse is this wreath with Australia in it and one sovereign below it. It's designed to be a very, very clear image of where these coins have been made. And that in some part reflects sort of colonial thinking really, that these branch mints or this branch mint in Australia could not possibly do as good a job as that in London. And therefore we need to make sure that the pristine, the real deal sovereign that's struck in London is easily distinguished from its Australian counterpart. There's a bit of an arrogance, if I'm honest, about that whole approach to it. And that is why initially you end up with two different sovereign designs, one for Australia and one for those that are made in the United Kingdom. As well as having a separate design, it is also not legal tender in the United Kingdom. It's only legal tender in Australia and in some very limited colonies around the globe as well. Those fears, however, that this branch mint in Sydney would not be producing the same quality as that in the United Kingdom soon proved to be unfounded. And as the branch mint got going and became established throughout the 1860s, it started to be seen that what they were producing was just as good as that coming out of the United Kingdom. And as a result of that, those fears died down, and by 1866, the legislation had been put in place to extend the legal tender limit of these coins to around the globe, to those British possessions that were taking the coins. Crucially as well, by 1871, that break came between allowing the branch mint in Australia to strike its own distinct sovereigns and that in the United Kingdom having a different design. So what happens in 1871 is you finally get both branches striking the same design. That watering down has therefore happened of all those fears that began a few years earlier. And so from 1871, the United Kingdom and Australia could strike the same designs. 1871 is an interesting year as well, because it's in that year that you finally get a return to St George. So the branch mints and the United Kingdom had the choice. They could produce the St George or they could produce the shield back sovereigns. This is the situation that we find ourselves in the following year in 1872 when the second branch mint is established in Australia at Melbourne. And Melbourne had the unusual situation whereby its coinage when it was first struck, the gold sovereigns it produced, were legal tender anywhere and were identical to those that were being made in the United Kingdom. The establishment of the Melbourne branch, however, does continue to demonstrate some of the difficulties of shipping coin and shipping material across the globe at this point in history. This isn't easy. So when the staff, the volunteer staff from the Royal Engineers, arrive for the new Melbourne branch in 1872, in January 1872, they arrive amid some confusion. And that is because prior to that, in the November, the HMS Rangoon that was transporting the new dies for the Melbourne branch and also the official documentation sank in the November on its way across to Australia. So when this new branch started, they didn't actually have all the official documentation and the dies. And this touches on quite a crucial point about these branch mints. Yet again, think back to that mentality I was talking about previously, whereby there's an element of distrust to some degree from London towards these colonists and these colonial branches. The branch mints were run very, very tightly from London, and London's long arm really did reach out and take control of these branches. They were not left to their own devices. Master tooling was shipped out yearly to these branch mints in order for them to produce coin. And these branch mints as well had to pay for their master tooling from London, and they were expected to still turn a profit despite paying for the tooling. And that meant that the branch mints often tried to eke out as much as they could from the master tooling that was made available to them. The third and final branch that was established in Australia was at Perth in 1899. And by this point, we were only striking the St George reverse designs. Finally, the shield reverses had been banished in 1887, and all you're left with at this point is the branches producing these the St George design. But what you'll notice on all of the images I've shown you, that they each have a little distinguishing mint mark to show where the coins have been made. So whether you've got an M for Melbourne or a P for Perth or an S for Sydney, that was the only difference by this point in time between those made overseas and those made in the United Kingdom. So where were all these sovereigns going? Well, that is a very good question. Many of them were going back to Britain. And by the end of the 19th century, you've got an active circulation in Britain of around about 100 million sovereigns. That's an awful lot of gold in circulation. To give you some modern equivalent, that's roughly around about £35 billion worth of gold that was in active day-to-day circulation just in Britain alone at the start of the 20th century. An absolutely crazy and phenomenal figure to have in the nation's pockets. And the branch mint sovereigns roughly made up around 40% of that £100 million worth of sovereigns in use. So it gives you an idea of roughly the proportion that was coming from Australia. Another market in particular for these Australian sovereigns, believe it or not, was India. Seems a bit unusual why these sovereigns were going across to India, but for many, many years they had found a home there. And the reason for that is to tie it in with the Indian culture. In India, they were often used quite regularly as a gift and also as a way of storing wealth. This is not in circulation, this is not being used daily really, but what instead you have is something that you can put to one side, safely knowing that you've got an investment that you can rely upon. And that traded in particular on the sovereign's reliability and its accuracy. If you gifted someone a sovereign, they knew exactly how much gold they had and how much it weighed. And that is why it was used quite regularly in gifts. And as well as these gifts of sovereigns in coin form, what would happen as well is quite regularly they would melt down the sovereigns to turn into jewellery. Yet again, if you're a jeweller looking to melt down something, you want to know exactly how much purity there is in that coin and the weight of the gold. Another aspect for the sovereign's reliability and accuracy that meant it was so heavily used in India. As well as the coins being melted down to go into jewellery, you can see from the slide that we have on screen that they were also used in jewellery. This is a fantastic reproduction necklace that we had made for an exhibition some years ago at the Royal Mint. And what you can see here is this very ornate necklace, and if you look at certain points in it, you can quite easily see the sovereigns that have been inserted into it. Yes, it is a reproduction, but it's a faithful reproduction of something that we know was going on quite significantly in India at the time. Another reason why India tended to favour particularly the early branch mint sovereigns from Australia, so think about those sovereigns which have got Australia written on them, was because of the colour of these coins. These early branch mint sovereigns were quite yellow, and that is because of the alloy mix that was used in making them. And by that I mean that the sovereign has always been 22 karat gold and the remainder should be made up of copper. However, in Australia in the 1850s and the 1860s, there was not sufficient technology to extract from the natural gold all the silver. So what happened in these early Australian sovereigns is they had a much higher proportion of silver in them, which made them much, much more yellow. This yellow gold was favoured in India, and also long after that the mint in England had continued to produce St George, the mint in Australia was actually producing the shield-backed sovereigns, yet again because they were favoured in India. That ties in to some degree with the use of a dragon on the coin and ties in with beliefs in India around the dragon. They didn't want to see the dragon being killed. So that is why the shield-back was favoured more so until it finally ceased in 1887. Although this demand in India you might think would lead instantly to some kind of branch mint being established over there, it did not. And it was many, many years before you actually got a branch operating in India. And even then, it only operated for a very, very short space of time. An emergency wartime expediency operating in 1918. And that is because what you wanted at 1918 was something that could produce gold sovereigns so that it could be used for the war effort. By 1918, for those of you who don't know, the sovereign had ceased to be a circulating gold coin. It was only a gold coin at this point in time that was really being used for the war effort. And the war was a huge, huge drain on British and colonial resources. It's very difficult to ship things in normal time, but it's extremely difficult to ship gold coin around the world during an international war. And the gold coins that were struck in India were part of this war effort. And in fact, there is rumours, and it's very difficult to say how true it is, that these Indian sovereigns went from India to the Middle East to help Lawrence of Arabia in his war against the Ottoman Empire and the whole Arab revolt. And we certainly know that Lawrence was using gold sovereigns over in the Middle East. Whether it was these 1918 India sovereigns is debatable, but he was using sovereigns an awful lot. And you get accounts of him rewarding the Arab leaders by going to them with a big bag of sovereigns. This is, written in his own words, and telling them they can take from that bag as many sovereigns as they wish, rewarding them for their fight with Britain against the Ottomans. Even though India only struck sovereigns for 1 year in 1918, it still struck far more sovereigns than another branchment that had been established much earlier, and that was the branch in Canada. Just like with Australia, the Canadian branch was established close to natural sources of gold. So gold is discovered in the Yukon in 1900, and in the 1905 you get calls for the establishment of a branchment to maximise and make the most of this gold resource. The first gold sovereigns are struck in Canada in 1908, but they are not struck extensively. And India strikes in 1 year more sovereigns than Canada did and Ottawa did in its entire 20 years of operation. And that is partly because over in the United States and over in Canada, the sovereign never really maintained that grip that it had around the rest of the world. In Canada in particular, the United States dollar is preeminent. It's not the sovereign which is dominating. And so it's United States gold coins to some degree which take the star and the leading light over in Canada. There is some sovereign use, but very limited throughout the history. And that is sort of partly explains why the Canadian branchment never really took off the ground as far as the sovereign operation was concerned. The final branchment to really speak about comes about after the end of the end of the First World War. And it might sound a bit unusual to some of you who know a little bit about the history of the sovereign, why on earth we're still establishing branchments after the end of the First World War. And I say unusual, and that is because the First World War really killed off the sovereign as a circulating gold coin. You do not get it in active day-to-day use in the United Kingdom after the end of the war. And we don't make it at the Mint in London as a result. The branches, however, continue to do so. And you end up with a branch established in South Africa in 1923, the year it begins striking gold sovereigns. Why do you do this? Well, the branches were continuing to strike these gold sovereigns not for active circulation, really. They were striking them as a means of shoring up the paper currency. They were designed to sit in a bank vault and wait until such time as they may be needed to continue to support this paper currency. Some of the branches still find a use for exports, because although I say that these gold sovereigns are not in active circulation, they still maintain a hold in some parts of the world, not really linked through to the United Kingdom at all. So the Middle East in particular, places like Egypt, always had this attraction to the gold sovereign, partly because of that reliability and accuracy side of it. And so Perth and South Africa are also exporting some of their sovereigns at a profit to places such as that, and that is a reason why they actually continue striking them. But South Africa is the last of the branch mints, really, and it brings to a close in some ways that heyday of the imperial sovereign. When we're looking at how the branches close, you start to see it beginning with Sydney in 1926. It shuts, and that is just because Sydney is the oldest of the branch mints. Its equipment is antiquated. It really cannot keep up with Melbourne and Perth, so it is closed in 1926. The last sovereigns are struck at Melbourne and Perth in 1931, and that is followed by Pretoria in 1932. So you're starting to see a wind-up of this operation. And Ottawa, Canada, had last struck its last sovereign in 1919. And so by 1932, all branch mint sovereigns had ceased to be struck. But one of the things about the sovereign story, it is the great survivor. It keeps going and has done for centuries in one form or another. And even to this day, within the last few years, India has started to produce branch mint sovereigns again. You can see here that we have an India mint mark sovereign that was produced in the last couple of years. This is the key thing about the sovereign story. There is still and always was a demand for this coin, and that reliability and the accuracy still is today as important as it was back in the early 20th century. And that, from a bullion perspective, explains its demand across the globe, but also from a beauty perspective. that St George and the Dragon is still as renowned today as it was when the decision was made in 1871 to bring it back onto the coinage because of its beauty. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Nikki Harris, Manager of the Collector Services Department. Now, in the previous webinar, I spoke about how proud and excited I was to come and work here for the Royal Mint. And when I did actually come here and was allowed on site for the first time, there's lots of little things around you that are very unexpected and surprising. When you come through security, you see the three flags with the Union Jack, the Welsh flag, and the flag of any visiting guests that are here at the Mint. There's various plaques around site as well. There's a plaque for the visit of Her Majesty and Prince Philip, for a visit from Princess Diana, the Princess of Wales as well. And also there's various old presses and equipment that was used at Tower Hill and brought down when the Mint moved to South Wales. Probably the most poignant artefact that moved down to South Wales though has to be the special memorial plaque that's dedicated to servicemen and women that lost their lives overseas in conflicts, including many that worked for the Royal Mint. So remembrance always plays a massive part of the Royal Mint calendar here. We have our moment of silence there once per year, and also we obviously produce commemorative coins every year commemorating the Remembrance Day. Now, apart from that though, we also have the Collector Services Department, where now we can offer the original coins that were used by men and women during both of those conflicts. And I'm glad to be able to show you three sets today, two with very, very close ties to World War I, and another that's a very special set for the coronation of King George V, who of course is synonymous with that conflict, World War I. So the first set we have here is the 1918 branch mint set. Now, 1918 was a very special year. By this point, Britain was no longer using sovereigns for circulated purposes. In fact, they were heavily discouraged from using those gold coins in circulation because they were really hoarding gold for the war effort. So it was part of the campaign, really. Lloyd George announced in Parliament that to use a sovereign was helping the enemy. So by that point, they weren't supposed to be used for circulation purposes, but they were still produced at branch mints around the British Empire. So it's a very interesting year, 1918. They were struck in 5 branch mints, but not in London. So you get the 3 sovereigns in this set from Australia, in Melbourne, Sydney and Perth. You also get the Canada issue as well. Now, the mintage for Canada is extremely low from all their years, but particularly in that year, just under 107,000 were issued. Now, compare that to some years where you get George V sovereigns that were struck in the tens of millions. It makes it a really, really sought-after year date, the 1918 Canada. And then finally, you have the very special 1918 India sovereign. Now, the story behind this, the gold before this was being shipped from South Africa up to London. But of course the Germans, the U-boats, the German Navy were trying to target our trading ships, particularly the gold ones. Now, if they had torpedoed a gold ship, then it really could have affected the outcome of the war. So a secret plan was hatched. The gold was shipped to India instead and struck at the Bombay Mint for 1 year only. And you can always distinguish these ones because they have the small I mint mark on the reverse of the coin. So the following year, of course, in 1919, the war was over, so there were no requirements to ever strike circulated sovereigns in Bombay ever again, making it a very sought-after one-year issue. So this is the set. All 5 sovereigns from 1918 are in this set. You can see some of the images on screen now. And the condition of the coin, they're all guaranteed to be in a minimum of very fine condition, so a very collectible grade. And here we have the First World War sovereign set. Now, this is a very special set. It has 5 sovereigns in there, and it's a complete run date of sovereigns from 1914, the outbreak of World War I, all the way to 1918, which is obviously the armistice. Very special because it's an end of an era. The story of the sovereign, well, it began in 1489 with Henry VII. Then fast forward to George III, you get the first machine-struck sovereign. And it was really this conflict that brought an end to the sovereign being used for circulation purposes. So it's a very, I would say, poignant set in terms of it's dedicated to the men and women that fought so bravely in World War I. But it's also in a numismatic sense very interesting as well, because it really is the end of an era here. So like I said, 5 sovereigns in there altogether. They're all in very fine condition again, so very collectible grade, and comes in a beautiful presentation box, actually wooden box in this one, and with a really detailed booklet with some lovely images in there of Tower Hill where they used to strike these coins, and some of the posters that were used during World War I to basically try and make people hand in their sovereigns and start using banknotes instead. So all adds to a fantastic set of coins, and one that most collectors have been looking to try and source for years. But with this set, you get it all in one go. So available on the website now in very fine condition. And the final set I'd like to show you today is the 1911 short specimen set. Now, this is a very special set that was produced for the coronation year of George V. All the coins in the set were struck in special proof quality, and that was very unusual for the time. So a very sought after set, and it contains 10 coins in total. So you get the sovereign, the half sovereign, the crown, the florin, the shilling, the sixpence, and the 4 Maundy coins as well. So a lot of people have asked about these over the years, because there is another set that some people get confused with, and the other set is called the long set. That actually contains all of these coins, but also the £2 and the £5 as well. But not a lot of people know that this set is actually rarer than the longer set. Just 952 of these short proof specimen sets were issued back in 1911. And that's in comparison to almost 3,000 of the longer sets. So very, very sought after. And of course, we're talking today about World War I. Now, George V, absolutely synonymous with that conflict. Not only did he lead us through the conflict, but his 2 cousins were also heavily involved, of course, being Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and Wilhelm II of Germany, both first cousins of George V. So a lot of people have actually dubbed the conflict the cousins at war, because they were all first cousins. So very, very sought after set, this one. Now, there is some delightful toning that you can see in the coins on screen, but apart from that, they are in as struck condition. So again, this one is on the website. Now, the other 2 sets that I showed you earlier, they are available in very small quantities, but I must stress there is only one of these 1911 specimen proof sets available. So please be quick, visit the website or call your account manager to reserve it for yourself today. And a final note then, we did mention about the long set. If you was interested in the long set, it's not one that we have at the moment, but we do have our coin finder service. So if you would be interested in finding that set, and we can come back to you then with the specifications and the price, just let us know. Or any coin or set that you've always looked for in the past and were unable to find, please let us know, and we can look through our coin finder service free of charge and come back to you with all the details. Thank you very much.